Welcome to the anti-bubble report for December 2025. Today we're going to be discussing the energy world is flat 2.0, implications for geopolitics, energy markets. The ideas of today are basically inspired on the ideas of my first book, which I co-wrote with my good friend Daniel Lacalle over 10 years ago. And as you might see from the title, it's inspired by one book from Thomas Friedman called The World is Flat, published in 2004. Over 20 years ago, which was a post-mortem analysis of the dot-com bubble. The ideas of this book are critical to understand, I think, especially given what's happening today with the potential development of a bubble in the AI world, which we will discuss shortly. And we'll also bring ideas from my second book, The Anti-Bubbles, with respect to the implications for macro. So we'll try to bring all this together: energy, geopolitics, inflation, macro, and technology and bubbles into a discussion that I hope you'll find helpful. Let's start with this key idea of a game changer technology, and the framework that was put forth by Friedman was this idea that a game changer technology, the way I define it, is there's a world before and after. In that sense, the dot-com and the development of the internet and broadband, there's no question in my mind that there was a world before and after. I would also argue that AI and machine learning, it's also game changer technology. And there are other technologies, things like blockchain or others, that you might ask yourself whether there's a world before and after. But clearly, there are technologies, such as is the case now or then, that they change the world as we see it. What followed this technological breakthrough is a second phase of a major, huge build-out in capacity and infrastructure. During that process, the valuations are high, the opportunities are big, and there's, in some ways, money that is coming to the sector attracted by both the opportunity, but also some degree of fear of missing out. There's a strategic premium that firms would pay just to stay in the game, even if they know that the prices they pay are high and they may or may not be able to recoup and make the expected returns from those investments. What happens next is we eventually reach a point of overcapacity. At that point, in the case of the dot-com, we had literally wired the oceans with broadband. If my numbers are not wrong, we actually had a 20-to-1 sort of overcapacity with respect to the demand at the time. What it means is eventually those huge returns, these huge expectations that were built that attracted that capital are not met. You see, prices collapsing, valuations collapsing, and those who were heavily indebted, they were not able to pay, and they went bankrupt. And so what we saw is this boom and bust of the bubble that eventually created what I think it's key here, which is this magical moment, which is the combination of game changer technology available in huge size, literally for free. And that's the moment when the world became flat. If you think back at the dot-com in 2001, if you were an accountant in India, which is the example that Friedman used in his book, well, before the dot-com, you were just able to do work for your neighbor. Now you could actually do work for someone in California. And that flattened the world, that effectively brought down regions. It really created the beginning of what we've seen afterwards. A lot of opportunities growing into these giants' shoulders. But I think as well that the dot-com, which after the bubble left a bit of a bitter feeling to many of us who lived through it. I think another key message that the book at least gave me beyond this very important framework that has stayed with me is this idea that bubbles effectively accelerate the impact of these game-changer technologies. What should have taken perhaps 10 years was deployed within months or short period of time. And I think this is where we're seeing in some ways a bit of a similar dynamic today with the billions and billions or hundreds of billions of dollars that are being invested with a lot of capacity into the AI world, and to some extent the capacity across and the competition between ChatGPT or Gemini or Grok or many others, effectively showing some parallels to this race of technology and huge capacity that is based on both opportunity and perhaps FOMO. So I think there will be, in my view, a bit of a repeat of what we witnessed then, and perhaps the winners and the losers that the market might be anticipating today may not be the ones that play out. There's also this linear view of the world with respect to the growth, which I think we're starting to see constraints potentially in the energy sector and the power side, which brings us sort of into this idea of the flattening of the energy world, the thesis that Daniel and I put forward 10 years ago, which has not only survived, it's actually been reinforced by the passage of time. And I think in that sense, the Russia-Ukraine war has brought back to life, and I think we're seeing a new wave with huge consequences, as we're going to discuss shortly. The other key concept that Friedman gave us is this idea of a flattener, which he defines as a force, event, or technology that levels the global competitive playing field. And what happened here is, I was this framework stayed in my mind, and there were a few developments which we'll discuss shortly that effectively triggered this analogy, these similarities between what happened in the dot-com, what was happening in the energy market with game-changer technologies. But Daniel and I put together, these 18 flatteners, which, if you look deeper, there are many more, as effectively forces that would flatten the energy world, would in some ways equalize and globalize the energy market, and to a large extent at the expense of crude oil and the benefit of others. As I said, I think these dynamics are continue to play out and will have meaningful consequences. If you have a very bullish and long position in crude oil, you should perhaps listen carefully. We'll start with a simple question, and that's, if you think about the past few decades, you think about the success of crude oil and OPEC, and I asked, do you think this is based on, or what's the reason the OPEC has been so successful? I would argue that most of you would be thinking, well, clearly, OPEC controls the supply, therefore they can control the price. Most people would argue that there's an oligopoly of supply that drives this dominance. My view is fair enough. This is a necessary condition, but not necessarily sufficient, because in our view, what's really been driving this dominance of crude oil, it's been a monopoly of demand, and it's actually a monopoly of transportation demand, because over the last few decades, what's happened in the world is we've seen, the globalization has witnessed this tremendous growth in demand for transportation, which has been met with this oligopolistic behavior. At the end of the day, our cars or motorcycles or buses or trains or our ships, our planes, our trains, the whole thing is effectively being fueled by gasoline and diesel and kerosene and fuel oil. which are effectively crude oil products. So I think in that sense, one of the key points here is, the necessary condition, but not sufficient. But I think this has created huge misconceptions, and this can actually lead to bubbles. It can lead to behavior where effectively you might believe that the world needs your oil, or you're in full control, arguably for the wrong reasons. The moment this monopoly of demand disappears, the whole house of cards crumbles, which I think is the case. So let's go through some of these misconceptions. And back when we published the book over 10 years ago, the subtitle was "Opportunities Heading or From the End of Peak Oil." And peak oil is this view that very logically you think about, well, we've had this, the planet Earth, the crude oil that is being produced over whatever millions of years. It's finite, and we're consuming it. We must be running out, and therefore crude oil prices can only go up due to scarcity. And we had this Mad Max view of crude oil, perhaps at $500 or whatever was the view at the time. The reality is, this is not just about the shortages of the scarcity. This is a story about technology, but even when you think about the availability of crude oil, there's no real shortage of any hydrocarbon. What happens with crude oil, and we'll talk a lot about shale oil and gas as one of those game changer technologies in the crude oil market. What's clear with crude oil is that it's not so much about shortage, is largely about the uneven distribution. Those of you who as you know that Saudi Arabia, for example, is one of the largest players in the oil market for the longest time. That dominance comes from very unique geological circumstances. Once upon a time, all that land used to be covered with water. I would go up over decades, will go down. There's a lot of vegetation which would basically grow and die, and over millions of years, you're generating this movement, this action with water coming and receding, and these things that would effectively lead to this vast amount of resources. Those conditions were very unique. They have not happened as such in any other part in the world in that scale. And but there is crude pretty much everywhere, in many places, in different forms, in different prices and technologies to access. Natural gas, things like methane, it's also extremely abundant. There's a tremendous amount of gas and coal all over the world, and even if you think about it, and to the surprise of many, including myself, whilst I was researching for the book, there's things like a frozen methane, which is effectively natural gas that is effectively sitting in the seabeds in frozen state. There is more frozen methane in the world than all the oil, gas, and coal combined. So it just happens to be extremely difficult and expensive to extract, but we know it is there. And in fact, that was the case with shale oil and gas. We always knew it was there. It was a question of can we access it. One of the related to this idea of peak oil, one of the headlines of the book that caught more attention was this idea that and the last barrel of oil will not be worth millions. It'll be worth zero. And that was really a bit of a shock for people at the time, and it was sort of testament of this idea of the relentless power of technology in terms of how we fall in love with the problem and not the product. So one of these game changer technologies for the crude oil and the energy markets and natural gas came in the form of horizontal drilling and fracking. Horizontal drilling is basically digging holes. Instead of vertically up down, you have the ability to take bends and literally do it parallel to the surface. That was an incredible feet by my fellow petroleum engineers, and fracking, which is basically the combination of hydraulic rock fracturing, effectively allowed the combination of these two things allowed to break these rocks and release the gas and the oil that were trapped and captured. The perhaps three key themes that I would highlight about this technology, and it's already 15, perhaps almost 20 years old, so it's not new news, but it was a game changer in the sense that it really opened a huge amount of volume. It did it with relatively low prices, $60 a barrel of oil equivalent, which with $100+ oil made a big difference. But I think the key point was also the speed of response. For the longest time, if you thought about the typical cycle in the energy markets, if we discovered oil in Alaska, it would take somewhere between 10 to 15 years since that drop of crude oil would be effectively in your car. Those very, very long cycles are part of the reason why conventional crude and was the dominance of OPEC. But I think what we see with shale, it was the game change. We were able to effectively move this from those periods to just 3 to 6 months. And it did it in a way where we're literally able to open and close the taps without actually damaging the fields. And so in some ways, the shale revolution for both oil and gas had a tremendous impact. But not everyone, even if there's huge resources in many other parts of the world, there's a lot of environmental considerations, which is the reason why the USA has been the primary leader in this space. But don't fool yourselves, they're not the only ones. It's perfectly feasible. There's plenty of gas in this capacity. What it did is this tremendous growth resulted in a major glut of natural gas inside of the USA, which, by the way, once upon a time was positioned to be an importer of natural gas in the form of liquefied natural gas, LNG. We'll talk a lot more about that shortly. But this, tremendous amount of gas suddenly available, which without the ability to export it easily created this major glut, which is a big part of the dynamics of what's happened in later on this story of the flattening of the energy world. What it did, and also very importantly, is it created a major competitive advantage for the USA. I think North America has part of the success in the last 15 years. It's been an energy dominance. Energy is everywhere. It's in electricity, it's in industrial use, it's in many other areas. And the fact that the USA was able to enjoy a fraction of the cost, especially during difficult times, such as the recent war between Russia and Ukraine, it's been, in my opinion, one of the key drivers that of dominance of the US beyond of obvious other that the world are aware, such as technology, etc. But this dynamic, this game changer technology, happened, almost simultaneously as Fukushima. This was, the third largest nuclear or earthquake and tsunami in the history. It created the greatest natural accident, nuclear accident since Chernobyl, a long time ago. And what happened is there was a knee-jerk reaction almost immediately. Not only Japan, which stopped completely their production of power generation from nuclear for probably obvious reasons, but also from others that were very distant and not really at risk of any earthquakes or tsunamis, such as Germany, which within a few days decided to pull the plug of nuclear and basically start, in some ways, the vulnerability of Europe to Russia. So the Fukushima event is very much a key part into some of the geopolitical dynamics we're seeing. But Fukushima had very deep implications for energy markets. It by removing that natural gas, effectively by removing nuclear from the stack of power generation, we were forced to produce electricity using other stuff, and that meant burning coal, burning natural gas, or even burning crude. And basically, the natural gas market, Japan in particular, became a huge magnet. It was attracting those molecules of gas by paying huge prices, which meant that the prices in Japan were more than 10 times the price that North America was paying. This disruption lasted for many years, and the expectation was there, and that effectively led to this huge price differential between natural gas in some parts of the world and others, created this response, this wall of natural gas that followed within the next 3 to 5 years. We wrote the book before this wave coming, but you could see it. You could see it in understanding the investment cycle, what was happening in places like the Gorgon in Australia, or even places like Israel, which suddenly became their natural gas resources are very meaningful, became actually a superpower, believe it or not, in that field. The consequence, and one of the concepts that I'm very proud that we coined in the book, was this idea of comparing liquefied natural gas to floating pipelines, and this concept of the energy broadband. So the way it works is natural gas is a gas, and it's actually if you want to ship it from one place to another, you can do it in gas form through pipelines, but think about how hard it would be to build a pipeline from Australia to a place like China. In Europe, for example, we have a pipeline going from North Africa into Spain, the Al Maghreb, and but there are limits to how far you can go with effectively these pipelines. On the other hand, what you can do is liquefied natural gas. You need an incredible amount of engineering and technology to bring it down to minus 200 plus degrees, which effectively compresses the amount to a small fraction, and it allows us to basically transport it in liquid form to other parts of the world and then regasify it. As you can imagine, 99.99% of the difficulty is to liquefy it. By the time it gets to the other side, all you need to do is just let it go back to normal temperature, and then it just becomes gas again. So what happened here is places like Australia made 500 billion plus investments into natural gas, attracted by these huge prices, and gas that once upon a time was stranded in parts of the world that made it unreachable, suddenly were able to be floated or liquefied. And the beauty of floating pipelines is that you can actually connect to anywhere in the world. So it's not just bilateral Australia to Japan. It can actually go anywhere. And this is important because the natural gas it existed before, but these major investments were generally done with 20-year agreements on take-or-pay contracts, where these $10-15 billion investments, which take many years, would require the other side to take the gas. Otherwise, the one side would be at risk, and therefore you had this phenomenon where there were no spare gas. It was like no singles. There was a male for every female. The market was matched. But in some ways, the development of shale in the US meant that a lot of that LNG capacity that existed was no longer needed. Why would you import gas when you had a glut? And also this big signal from the widening prices meant it was sort of a green light for an opportunity for these countries to generate this capacity. Once that happened, you could see the wall of natural gas coming, and my head sort of brought this idea of flattening of the energy world as natural gas would emerge with suddenly became went from being a regional commodity into a more global commodity. And in my view, in my brain, it was very obvious that it would have severe consequences to crude oil, as it would impact the ability for natural gas to compete in areas like, for example, transportation, as it was the case. Now, another key misconception in the system, I would argue, is this view from some people and some OPEC members that the world needs my crude oil. And the answer is, yeah, we need it. We obviously want to enjoy the transportation benefits through gasoline, diesel, etc. But the answer is no one really needs crude oil per se. We all need to go from transportation from point A to B, and we want to do it with something that is abundant, reliable, cheap, and clean. And this is critical, and why this is a gross misconception. If you think that the world needs your crude oil, you might be in for a surprise, especially during times and opportunities where the system will be able to respond. And this brings me to this my favorite motto, probably, which is fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And why I think if you fall in love with crude oil or Bitcoin or whatever it is, instead of the actual product you're trying to solve, you might be in for some surprises. And so, just looking back, I know these ideas today sound pretty basic, but 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was much less obvious that we would have this major shift away from just the crude oil dominance into all sorts of different ways in which we would be able to run our basically solve the problem of transportation. And that includes compressed natural gas, LNG, all sorts of biofuels and electricity and renewables and many others. And this is key because ultimately the monopoly of crude oil demand, it becomes eroded because our dependence on crude diminishes. Now, I'll give you a couple of interesting, almost anecdotal examples and that I put forward in the book. Why did Warren Buffett buy the railway company BNSF in the USA? And when I saw the news, for me, it was pretty obvious that it was a natural gas trade. Basically, BNSF was the second largest consumer of diesel in North America, only behind the US military. And at the time, the trains where crude oil was over $100, but at the actual price of diesel, which is, you need to add the refinery margin, was over $150 a barrel, when natural gas prices in North America were just 1/10 of that, around $15 a barrel of oil equivalent. And obviously, if you're Warren Buffett and you see this and you say, wait a minute, I can actually buy the trains and switch from crude to gas and charge the same prices, then I'm going to make much bigger margins. And that shows you, what he did. So in some ways, when he started doing that, I think I didn't know. At the time, I just imagined that would be the reason. But it is a very clear example of the sort of flatteners and the power of the flattening, where if you have the second largest of diesel in North America moving away from diesel into natural gas, you're obviously reducing the demand for diesel, increasing for natural gas. And that means there's more diesel available, there's more abundance. And I think those bottlenecks and that power erodes, which is effectively what happened. One of the interesting things about commodity markets, fascinating as always, is we use all these funny units, in dollars per barrel, dollars per MMBTU, pence per therm, and the list is very long. And it's actually not obvious how to compare apples with apples. And there's this wonderful feature in Bloomberg that I've used a lot for many years, that allows us to convert these prices into barrel of oil equivalent. And you see clearly why, in this picture, the lines at the top are the price of crude oil and the forward prices. So this is already a couple months old, with crude in the mid-high 60s, whereas natural gas was in the teens. So even with crude at these levels, the actual apple with apple comparison to U.S. nat gas is big time in favor of such trade by Buffett. Think about it when crude was diesel was about 150. How wide that was. Yeah, if you want to keep one of these conversions in mind, this is quite harmful or helpful. The dollar BTU like 5.8 barrels of oil equivalent. So $2-3 a MMBTU is going to roughly be 12 to 18. So with that, the other fascinating thing that happened when I was writing the book is, we had a thesis of the flattening of the energy world, had been thinking about it from the perspective of perhaps the hydrocarbon space. But when we put the renewable energies to the test, it became truly extraordinary because not only survived the thesis, it reinforced it, became one of the key pillars as well. And I'll show you a couple of simple case studies, but obviously electric cars, where solar power is effectively feeding our cars is another example of demand that once upon a time was effectively gasoline or diesel that is becoming more solar. Love this quote from Jimmy Carter from the 70s, when the push for solar became huge. They can't embargo the sun away from us. It took many decades for solar power technology to really become available at the prices and quantities that the world requires. And it's been an exponential process in terms of the ability for those panels to produce electricity and the cost. So that effect, I think it's been extraordinary in yet another example of the incredible power of human ingenuity. The other example that I think is very interesting is from a supply perspective. Believe it or not, Saudi Arabia once upon a time produced a big chunk of their electricity by burning crude oil. It was one of the, if not the only place in the world where that was happening in scale. And if you're in the middle of the desert, why not produce electricity using solar, which of course they did. And so once again, the more power you produce with solar, the less power you need to produce burning crude oil, and that crude oil becomes effectively available, which reduces the bottlenecks, reduces the shortage, it increases the gap, and ultimately it's a very obvious flattener that adds to the long list of flatteners that remove that monopolistic power of crude oil. Now let's move on into geopolitics, another key aspect of the flattening of the energy world, acting as a strong force in both directions. Another of my favorite mottos, the good guy is the bad guy of his own movie. Certainly I tell myself at least 2 or 3 times for different reasons. And I think in this movie, there's obviously the consumers defend themselves, they're the good guys of their own movie. But we've seen how the consumers have lost the trust in Russia, how we suffered enormously through these dynamics, that take that crude away, or those natural gas. And we responded with things like subsidies, which don't really solve the problem. They'll delay transfer and enlarge it, as we'll link later with the macro view. But this is not just a story about the consumers defending themselves, because the producers also defend themselves. The producers lost the buyer. They will do whatever they can to find markets through the investment in infrastructure, and in some ways this optionality that is developed on both sides, both the consumers and the producers, this premium, this that we're willing to pay to have our energy security, which is not just about prices, it's also about molecules, is critical. And this sort of brings me into this idea that short-term shortages become long-term surpluses, or short-term volatility high volatility becomes long-term lower volatility. And this is a common theme in the markets. We saw over and over again how OPEC sort of thought the world needed their oil, will make the world pay for it. And we saw repeatedly back in 1986, for example, the response from the world to the embargo, and this was really across the board, with permanent demand destruction, and from crude oil being displaced, from crude, being pretty much just reduced to transportation demand. A lot of new technology, things like offshore, and became a priority. But there was also, a lot of the other side of the coin, as these dynamics were resulting in lower market share, they were also resulting in lower revenues. And at the end of the day, these countries need a certain amount of money to run. And when you produce, if you cut the production and you're producing less barrels at the same price, you're producing less dollars. And there's a point where effectively they had to fold. The bluff was called. And believe it or not, in 1986, Saudi, which was producing over 10 million barrels a day, they had effectively lost almost 8 of those million. And when it got down to 2.2, they realized that the damage was huge. They were earning very little money for their oil, and also they were effectively putting the money into their competitors' hands, who were enjoying their, which was being financed by them. So when they opened the taps, the world really, or crude collapsed to over $10 a barrel, and the world was awash with oil. But amongst other consequences, the Soviet Union collapsed. And this cycle sort of repeated again as we wrote the book. We saw things playing out, very much as we had discussed. At that time, different dynamics. Obviously, the development of shale oil had shifted from a $90 OPEC floor, which was considered to be that level where they were in control, to pretty much a $60 shale cap. And you can see that in how this really impacted the spare capacity of OPEC. I think if we look at the geopolitical picture in the more recent past, thankfully, the Israel versus Iran situation did not escalate into what could have been a terrible outcome. I think the situation is being managed in a delicate manner, very tricky. But I think for those of us who spend time in the Middle East, I've been truly impressed over the last few years. If you go to Abu Dhabi and you see the Abraham family area with churches, synagogue, and basically the different buildings being represented in mosques being represented with the same size and the same structure, with this trilogy of religions and the unity through Abraham. I think it's fascinating. If you go to the Louvre, you will appreciate as well this trilogy of the common origin. And I think this pressure is, I personally believe, is very positive. And I think in some ways this radicalization and this extremism, we all know what's happening in other parts of the world. I'm not going to get into the the politics. It's an absolute drama what's happening in Israel and Gaza. But at the same time, I think the point I'm making is that the situation between Israel and Iran could have been a catalyst for something big, as we witnessed previously in history. And in some ways, I think the situation was contained. Obviously, the, the the bottlenecks in the system, the LNG through the Strait of Hormuz is big. There could be events, but ultimately, I think the world is in a stronger position to defend itself. And I think one of the conclusions I reached from this exercise as well is the dependency of the world in the Middle East, and crude oil in particular, is diminishing to the extent that I think there's slow but gradual and inevitable de-linkage between crude oil and geopolitics, which I think for most of us has been a common theme, in the sense that I think conflicts in the region will have an impact, but the impact in crude oil is increasingly less an impact in the overall energy sector and transportation, due to all the dynamics we discussed before. So the geopolitical picture is and will continue to be a big issue, but in some ways there's some positive signs, and in some ways that dependence on crude oil is diminishing. I think the other interesting side of politics and geopolitics is how the U.S. is shifting after almost 20 years of bluffing that they would create the infrastructure for LNG to allow the U.S. to export. I think that has been there as a threat, so that people wouldn't necessarily grow faster, but at the same time, they knew well that if they start exporting the gas, and gas is where natural gas was to normalize, that could result in much higher energy prices inside of the U.S., which would impact their competitiveness. So I think the USA has been playing a game, but as Trump effectively announces the opening, I don't think it's a coincidence. I think he knows the wave of nat gas that is coming as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war and the incredible shock we suffered in Europe and other parts of the world as a consequence, both in terms of prices as well as molecules. In that sense, I think this is only going to add to this pressure of and if you ask me, will the market converge closer to the crude oil prices or natural gas prices? I'm pretty sure it will be on the lower end of the current range which is why crude oil could perfectly be at $20-30 in the next few years, and still be more expensive than natural gas. So again, those who think about crude oil as a one-way bet and cheap, maybe should think twice. Time will tell. Now, how does this link into our general framework on the macro view? And when I wrote the anti-bubbles opportunities heading into gold's perfect storm, which, by the way, everyone's talking about gold today, the writing's been on the wall for many years. I think this is the natural result of the theme that we've been discussing for many years now, which is this gross misconception that when we have a problem, we can fix it through effectively money printing and debt. This idea that monetary and fiscal policies solve problems. They don't. All they do is four things. They delay the problems. They kick the can down the road through printing, spending, and borrowing. They transfer the problems, things like currency wars or trade wars. Effectively, they are passing that problem around. Think about the contagious nature of monetary policy. I would argue that the only reason we had the negative nominal interest rates in Europe was because the U.S. Federal Reserve was at zero, i.e., had the Fed been at 2%, we would have never ever seen negative nominal yield. So a lot of what's happening in this space is trying to beggar thy neighbor, effectively gain competitiveness through the exchange rate, and these things actually can come and bite you, as we're seeing in some countries. But ultimately, the third thing that's happening, when you abuse monetary and fiscal policies, you're transforming the problems. If you print trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, of course, you're going to see inflation. Inflation is not so much about the value of my house going up; it's more about the value of the paper with which I buy it going down. And unfortunately, inflation has this close cousins: inequality, populism, social unrest, and war. Which is why those of you who have a copy of the book, Anti-Bubbles, dedicated by me, probably reads, I hope you like it, I hope I'm wrong, because I feel that as a doctor diagnosing a terrible disease to a friend, as a doctor, I want to be correct. As a friend, I want to be wrong, because I think this is not necessarily going to end up well. This monetary and fiscal abuse is compounding, and unfortunately, it's not a zero-sum game. It's actually enlarging the problems. So, in the book, I talked about the last decade being more about the transformation of risk-free interest into interest-free risk, with stupidities such as long-dated bonds paying deeply negative nominal rates. So you lend $100, and the best case is you get 90 or whatever the number was, with zero interest, all filled in this gross misconception that inflation was the enemy and you can print ad infinitum without any consequences, which is obviously not true. I think the next decade will really be about the transformation of bubbles too big to fail into stagflation, where stagflation is the mix of stagnant and inflation. So you have economies that don't grow whilst the prices go up, which is not just prices, is the purchase power going down, which is a bit of a nightmare for the world. So in that sense, when you think about printing your way out of trouble, we've seen all these tools the central banks have been using, hiding into acronyms, and all the way from QE and quantitative easing to many others. And the ultimate conclusion is, I love this quote from Voltaire, who would tell us that paper money eventually converges to its intrinsic value, which it's obviously paper, which is the reason why gold in particular, but real assets in general, are set to benefit, and why arguably we might see taxation in a big way of many of these things as governments try to square the circle. In that sense, this idea of borrow your way out of trouble, I think it's also very creative in how they do it. I challenge everyone on this call to tell me one single problem we have not fixed or tried to fix or patch through a combination of printing and borrowing. Even the Russia-Ukraine war with huge energy prices, the solution was to subsidize the energy through the governments, where obviously the government was paying these huge prices. Consumers were shielded by lower prices, but that difference was being paid by the governments with money they didn't have, that they had to borrow, that eventually will not be able to pay back, that eventually leads to currency devaluation, which is how everything finishes in the end, through currency devaluation and inflation. So I would argue that the most important acronym for the next decade is yield curve control, YCC. Think about yield curve control as QE on steroids. During QE, Jerome Powell was given $120 billion a month. So Jerome, here's the money, go and spend it. and he did. And people would claim that was not inflationary, just literally printing money out of the blue and buying stuff. Here is worse, because here is like, okay, now you don't even have 120 billion a month. You have infinite, as much as you need, so that the bond yields don't get out of control, and governments don't get go into bankruptcy, which many of them are already in technical bankruptcy. So if you think about Japan, which has had a yield curve control for many years, but never really had to tap it until they did. And the day they did, because 10-year Japanese government bonds were at 0.1%. Why? Because I said so, and people believe that based on this crazy idea that inflation again was the enemy, and you can print ad infinitum. I think as some of these things play out, what you see is that the as rates went up in other parts of the world, central banks were reacting not just to inflation but to inflation expectations. Eventually, BOJ, as the market was demanding for higher returns, and the 10-year JGB went to 25 basis points. And the first time they tapped on it, the market said, "Oh my God, this is it." Dollar yen went from 117 to 124, and then went all the way to 160. Because effectively, what you're doing here is yield curve control is a mechanism that transforms a credit problem into an inflation problem and a currency devaluation. And by the way, the yield curve control is already de facto in place in Europe. Think about that first jumbo hike from minus 0.75 to 0. Sounds like science fiction, but yeah, the market was panicking because we were bringing interest rates to 0. And along that announcement, the ECB, the European Central Bank, made another announcement, which was they introduced something called the anti-fragmentation tool. And what it meant in plain English is, we're going to hike rates, but don't mess around with Spain or Italy, because if you do, I'm just going to buy the whole thing. And you know what happened with the LTROs back after, Draghi said we'll do whatever it takes. What happened is, effectively the way the government reacted, the incentives they gave, the way they structure things, is they were able to get those yields much lower, and so the market never really saw any type of stress, even if the fiscal situation was far from ideal. So I think this is going to be critical. It's not just Japan. I think we'll see a third arrow in the US, de facto in different ways in many other parts of the world, China, Europe. This is a global problem, and why it's a tricky game. But ultimately, I think it all comes down to this idea of inflate your way out of trouble, which is the consequence of that monetary and fiscal abuse. You've heard me before. I think 2% official inflation is absolute BS. It's, first of all, they make us believe that inflation is just this one number. Those of you listening to this, and my inflation is different from yours, different from your friend, different from your, whoever. Some has nappies, and some people have university fees. So there's no such thing as just one inflation number. There are many of them. The 2% number is so that I think it's scientifically calculated so that us frogs stay in that monetary broth. For those of you who are not familiar with the analogy, they say that if you throw a frog in boiling water, it jumps, but if you throw it into regular water and you just boil it, it will never jump. It will die boiled. And that's sort of what's happening with inflation. And as I put it back in the book in 2017, and before, is this is the pattern of what's happening. That 2% official inflation. Think about the compounding effect, even at a 2% number, which is obviously not a fair reflection of reality. I would argue that real inflation is at least twice, possibly way more. But at 2% over 10 years is 20% plus compounding. Over 20 years is 40% plus compounding. But if you actually make it 3%, it becomes exponential. So you lose about 80% of your purchase power over 20 years. And when you're my age, 20 years is not what it used to be. It's basically yesterday. So I think this entire party, this global financial party is being financed, in my opinion, through cash, fixed income, and credit investors who are effectively short inflation. This has very deep consequences for portfolio construction. It has deep consequences for many things. I think fixed income in the 60-40 balance portfolios, which were designed with this idea that fixed income is a good defender. I think there's serious challenges. First of all, in real terms, it's, in my opinion, a terrible investment in the long term. You're a frog. Even if you have a benchmark and you're underweight, you're still handcuffed to the ball, and the fact that you get your neck out doesn't mean you're not getting boiled in the rest of your body, which is bad news. So I think it's really bad news in real terms. Second, the problems we discussed, I think, mean that that defensive power of fixed income is less than it used to be. In fact, it may well be part of the problem. And so I think fixed income being the conventional defender of the portfolio, I think it requires other ways to defend in a more reliable way. Fixed incomes become very unreliable. It is true that it can work and will work under certain scenarios, but under certain others, such as 2022, those correlations break, and you have a risk of code drawdown, equity down, fixed income down, which exposes the pre-existing fragility of the portfolios, and why at Quadriga we build strategies that are effectively trying to find more reliable reactive sources of protection and convexity, rather than just relying on fixed income, which is, in my opinion, a serious consideration. With all that, let's bring it back to today. We talked about. Started with game changer technologies, energy, macro. Let's close the circle with AI and the super cyclical drivers of this flattening of the energy world, which I believe is happening. Indeed, machine learning and artificial intelligence are a game changer technology. We're seeing huge amount of investment going into these opportunities, both through opportunity and fear. I believe we are seeing overcapacity, and we will see write-offs. There's a lot of concerns and circular references and different things that are misconceptions built in. And eventually, I think there'll be plenty of winners, plenty of losers, not necessarily the ones we anticipate today. But I do think the world will become flatter. There will be a world where you are a doctor in Alaska. You'll have access to the best advice. And so, as a patient, I think you benefit from a world where everyone's been empowered. Education, I think, is going to be a game changer. How for the longest time, children with access to private tutoring were sufficiently ahead to be able to keep that cycle and get the better grades and go to the better units. So I think that in some ways AI is now private tutor of the highest quality, and needless to say, how it's changing businesses, including my own, where we are taking full advantage of what the technology has to offer, and we're having a lot of fun learning through the process. But I think these dynamics are key, are huge, and so if I was to ask, is AI a game changer? The answer, I think, is absolutely yes. Are we in a bubble? My view is, based on the view of the anti-bubbles, is think about if you think about bubbles, going back to Soros' definition of bubbles, effectively artificial evaluations based on misconceptions. I think it's, rather than try to base them on some ratios or numbers. I think it's really all about, tell me the belief, tell me the misconception, I'll tell you the bubble. And if you look at things like Nvidia and other amazing companies, the valuations we're seeing are effectively built upon pillars that may or may not be necessarily truths. Uh, I'm the only guy who can do this. I have infinite demand. I can keep my margins forever. There are no bottlenecks. I can deliver on everything. I really think that's many of those will be challenged, and I think those valuations will eventually um, effectively be questioned. And I think we shouldn't confuse the incredible value of the technology with the valuations. I think as Warren Buffett would say, price what you pay, values what you get. And I think the value is great. The from from some of these technologies, the price we shall see. So I think watch out for the winners and losers. Clearly, a whole new world of many opportunities, including solopreneurs, one man, $1 billion companies, as we're starting to see emerge. Another key thing, just linking back to energies, is the potential bottlenecks that are building in the power generation sector. The energy demand and what we're seeing both for training as well as usage, I think are, in my opinion, shifting some of the bottlenecks in energy markets from transportation to power. So interestingly, it might be, that copper is in some ways the new oil, and expressing in other metals might be in a very strong position to benefit from some of these dynamics. And last but not least, think about the implications in geopolitics and politics, right? Who really runs the world, with the mega corporations, the Apples, the control of the information and what it means, but also the threats of our dependence and the threats to cybersecurity and what AI might be able to do, not only if it's used for the better, but also for the bad, which I think it's definitely going to be the case. But I'm an optimist. I've always been. I think technology is here to make our lives better, and I think AI is a game changer, and we think it should be embraced, even if we have extensive challenges along the way. With that, I'll conclude with some high-level thoughts, but obviously, we talked a lot about the concept of game-changer technologies. We talked about the concept of flatteners, how bubbles, effectively accelerate the impact. And what we're seeing is this incredible virtuous process of investment and capacity. We need to see, how eventually, these flatteners erode the competitive landscape. In the case of energy, I think crude oil and OPEC are permanently damaged. I think with deep implications for geopolitics. Things like natural gas, which will emerge as a massive winner in volume, not necessarily in price. And I think the aftermath of what's still going as a war in Russia, Ukraine, will be this huge wave of natural gas. This energy disinflation is good news from a part of the industry, but again, the bottlenecks are moving from transportation to power. But at the same time, don't fool yourself. Inflation is really structural. It's like the entropy of the universe. It only goes up, and is the result of relentless government central bank printing and borrowing. So I think in that sense, the theme will continue to play out as we head into stagflation, as every single problem is met with more of the same. And watch out for that structural inflation and what it means for portfolio construction, including fixed income and its loss of reliability as a defender in portfolio construction, the risk it poses to capital preservation, and last but not least, the new game changer AI, what it means for us, the reminiscences to the .com, the risks and opportunities that arise from the bubble, and what it means for not just technology and markets, but also energy, inflation, and geopolitics. So with all that, a big round trip from technology, macro, energy. I hope you have found it helpful, and look forward to your comments and feedback. Thank you, everyone, and speak soon.